12,000 years ago, the Earth was locked in ice. Vast glaciers blanketed the northern hemisphere. Temperatures were brutal. Humans lived on the edge of survival, bundled in animal hides, huddled around fires, hunting massive beasts like the woolly mammoth. But slowly, everything began to change. The climate warmed. Ice sheets started melting, retreating toward the poles. Sea levels rose. Rivers carved new paths. Land bridges vanished beneath waves. Forests crept into open plains. What had been frozen tundra now teemed with birds, plants, and small animals. This was not a sudden event. It took centuries. But it was dramatic enough to shift the course of human history. This moment marked the end of the Pleistocene and the beginning of a new age, the Mesolithic. Humanity was forced to adapt. The massive animals they once relied on began disappearing, some hunted to extinction, others unable to cope with warmer climates. The Earth changed its rules. And so did humans. They became more resourceful. They turned to smaller game, deer, rabbits, wild boars. They fished rivers and gathered shellfish. They tracked seasonal migrations and followed patterns of birds. They explored wetlands and forests that once didn't exist. These early Mesolithic people were still hunter-gatherers, but they were different. More refined. More observant. More versatile. Their tools evolved. Their techniques improved. Their worldview began to shift, from short-term survival to longer-term adaptation. It was not yet civilization. But it was no longer Paleolithic life either. It was the beginning of something in between. A moment in time when nature stepped back and humans stepped forward. The Ice Age had ended. The world was warming. And humans, ever adaptable, were still here. But who exactly were the people of the Mesolithic? They weren't a single tribe. They weren't even a single species in the beginning. Instead, they were a scattered mosaic of early humans, diverse, mobile, inventive, living across a reshaped planet. They spoke different proto-languages. They used different tools. But they shared one thing: they were survivors of transformation. In Western Europe, Mesolithic hunter-gatherers roamed the newly thawed forests of Britain, France, and Scandinavia. In these lands, once buried beneath glaciers, new ecosystems exploded into life. Red deer, wild boar, trout-filled streams. Here, humans lived in small bands, moving with the seasons. They hunted with spears, trapped birds, and fished the rivers. In Eastern Europe and Central Asia, other groups followed reindeer and steppe game. Their shelters were more rugged. Their winters harsher. But they crafted elaborate bone tools and left behind mysterious carvings, half-human, half-animal figures. Shamans? Gods? We don't know. Further south, in the Near East, what is now Turkey, Syria, and Iraq, humans began gathering in larger communities. These weren't yet cities. But they weren't nomadic camps either. People returned to the same places, year after year. They built circular homes of stone and wood. Some even buried their dead beneath the floor, suggesting a bond to place, a concept of home. In India and Southeast Asia, groups adapted to dense tropical forests and coastlines. They fished, foraged, and learned to live with monsoons. Their tools were different: polished stone axes, shell ornaments, bamboo spears. Some scholars believe these early coastal people were among the first to cross oceans, using primitive rafts to reach island chains long before farming spread. Even in Australia, Mesolithic-era Aboriginal peoples developed deeply spiritual relationships with the land. They mapped the continent with songlines, oral maps passed from generation to generation, singing their way through deserts and valleys. Their memory was their map. Their myth was their compass. These were not primitive people. They were scientists without books, architects without blueprints, ecologists without equations. Everything they knew about the stars, the animals, the plants, the seasons, was learned through living. They didn't just live in nature, they interacted with it, shaped it. Burned undergrowth to create hunting grounds. Dug simple irrigation channels. Carved stones to align with solstices. These early humans were experimenting, not with technology, but with lifestyle. What they all shared was a growing shift in behavior. A longer memory, not just where the animals had gone, but when they'd return. A deeper attachment to place, not just camps, but sacred grounds. A wider connection to others, through trade, marriage, or shared myth. Some groups met and merged. Others clashed. These were not peaceful times, but neither were they constant wars. Conflict came and went like the tides. But the long arc bent toward collaboration, toward community. For the first time, humans began to think not just about today, but about tomorrow. Not just about survival, but continuity. This was the soul of the Mesolithic, a period of waiting, experimenting, listening. It was not a climax, but a pause. A long breath before the storm of agriculture. And yet within that pause, humans changed, quietly, profoundly. They became us. In the Mesolithic era, survival still depended on tools, but tools had changed. No longer were they just simple flakes chipped from stone. Now, they were smaller, sharper, more specialized. The Mesolithic was the age of microliths, tiny stone blades crafted with astonishing precision. These microliths were revolutionary. They weren't used alone. Instead, they were embedded into wooden shafts or bone handles, creating complex, composite tools. A spear wasn't just a stick with a point, it was a carefully assembled weapon of multiple parts, balanced for strength and distance. This innovation unlocked new possibilities. Hunting became more efficient. Lightweight arrows tipped with microliths could now bring down smaller, faster animals. Slingshots, traps, barbed harpoons, every region adapted tools to match the new ecology. In rivers, stone weights were tied to woven nets. Hooks made from carved bone helped harvest fish. And for the first time, bow and arrow technology appeared, silent, deadly, precise. It wasn't just weapons. Tools were used to prepare food, build shelters, and process hides. Stone scrapers removed fur. Drills pierced holes in bone. Awls stitched clothing. Polished axes cut trees. Humans had moved beyond reaction, they were engineering. Some Mesolithic peoples even began to store tools, bundling them together in leather rolls, burying seasonal caches in safe spots, or trading toolkits with neighboring groups. The concept of portable technology had arrived. And with tools came specialization. Some members of the tribe focused entirely on toolmaking, knapping flint, shaping antler, heating stones to fracture them cleanly. These artisans weren't warriors, but they were just as vital. Fire, too, was more than warmth, it was part of the toolkit. It was used to harden wood, boil water, smoke meat, and even to crack open rocks or sterilize tools. Fire was no longer tamed, it was partnered with. This was an era of quiet ingenuity. There were no machines. No metal. Yet everywhere humans lived, the marks of intelligence were clear. Tools weren't just made to survive. They were made to solve problems. In this chapter, we see not just sharper stones, but sharper minds. The Mesolithic was not just a time of smarter tools, it was a time of smarter survival. Gone were the days of chasing mammoths across endless plains. With climate change came new ecosystems. Forests replaced tundra. Rivers widened. Lakes appeared. The world became rich, but also unpredictable. And so, humans evolved their approach to food. Hunting changed. Large prey had vanished, so Mesolithic hunters adapted. They tracked deer, boar, elk, and even small animals like hares, foxes, and birds. Ambush replaced the chase. Traps replaced brute force. They used pitfalls and deadfalls, concealed snares made from twisted plant fiber, and even trained dogs, yes, dogs, to help in hunts. The earliest evidence of domesticated dogs appears in Mesolithic graves, buried beside humans not as tools, but companions. Fishing emerged as a key strategy. People built canoes from hollowed tree trunks. They used bone hooks, spears, harpoons, and weighted nets to catch salmon, trout, eels. In coastal regions, shellfish became a staple. Massive piles of shells, shell middens, remain today as monuments to a diet built on patience and precision. Gathering, too, evolved. Humans no longer foraged randomly. They learned seasonal patterns. They mapped where berries ripened in spring, where nuts fell in autumn. They tracked roots, tubers, edible leaves. Some even began tending wild plants, not farming yet, but encouraging growth by clearing weeds or scattering seeds. In swampy areas, they dug up water lilies. In forests, they harvested honey, moss, and mushrooms. And throughout, they observed, tested, remembered. Food was now about timing and territory. Groups moved with the seasons, not aimlessly, but deliberately. They followed cycles. Built storage pits. Left markers. They had begun to read the land. And with better food strategies came better health. Skeletons from this era show improved nutrition compared to earlier periods. Children lived longer. Adults were stronger. Communities grew larger. But food wasn't just survival. It became ritual. Some animals were hunted with ceremony. Some fish were only caught at certain times. Shells were turned into jewelry. Bones into charms. A meal was not just fuel, it was culture. This chapter is not just about what they ate, but how they lived around it. Every snare, every fishing line, every berry picked, was part of a delicate conversation with nature. And it was a conversation humans were finally learning to lead. In the Paleolithic world, humans were almost always moving, chasing herds, following seasons, escaping danger. But in the Mesolithic, something shifted. They began to stay. Not all the time. Not permanently. But long enough for something new to happen: settlement. Mesolithic groups started returning to the same places, year after year, season after season. Places rich in game. Near rivers, lakes, or coastal wetlands. Areas where fish were abundant, where plants grew in predictable cycles. And slowly, these temporary camps became semi-permanent homes. Shelters evolved. No longer just branches and hides. Now they built structures, circular or oval huts made of wood frames, covered in bark, turf, or animal skin. Some dug pits into the ground for warmth. Others used stones to line walls. These were not caves, they were crafted spaces. Personal spaces. Protected from wind, rain, and cold. Inside, there were fire pits, storage holes, even areas for sleeping and working. Some had stone-paved floors. Others had drainage ditches. These were not just camps, they were the beginning of architecture. And where homes appeared, communities followed. Small groups of families, perhaps 20, 30, sometimes 100 people, began to live together. Not just by chance, but by choice. Cooperation became essential. Someone fished. Someone cooked. Someone watched the fire. Someone cared for children. Work was divided. Roles emerged, not yet inequality, but structure. We see it in their remains: shared hearths, common refuse pits, joint burial sites. This was more than survival. It was society forming. Conflict surely existed: space, jealousy, resources, but so did cooperation. People built trust, negotiated, established territory. Some groups even developed shared symbols or tokens, early forms of record-keeping or trade. The act of staying changed everything. It meant roots. It meant memory. It meant long-term thinking. And with that came ritual. In many Mesolithic sites, we find the dead buried under homes or beside hearths. Children buried with beads. Adults laid to rest with tools, shells, or ochre. Some skulls painted red. Some graves revisited and reopened. These weren't just practical burials. They were emotional. Spiritual. Homes were now not just shelters, they were sacred space. This chapter is the story of that subtle but profound shift, from mobile bands to emerging communities. The first sparks of permanence. The first whispers of civilization. Not cities. Not yet. But the roots of everything to come. As Mesolithic people settled into more stable lives, their minds began to reach beyond survival. They started to ask questions. Why do the stars move? Where do the dead go? What makes the rains fall or the fish return? They didn't have science. But they had curiosity. They had pattern recognition. And they had stories. Across Mesolithic Europe and Asia, cave walls began to change. In the Paleolithic, they had painted mammoths and bison, big game and great hunts. But now, the paintings became more personal, more abstract. We see humans, dancing, fishing, performing rituals. We see symbols, dots, lines, spirals, handprints. What did they mean? We may never fully know. But we know they meant something. Art became more portable. People carved antlers, bones, and stones with geometric patterns. They made pendants from shells, animal teeth, and polished pebbles. These weren't tools. They were expressions of beauty, identity, or belief. Some items were buried with the dead. Some were placed in hearths. Some were deliberately broken, perhaps as offerings. The spiritual world of the Mesolithic was invisible, but everywhere. In burial grounds, we find carefully posed bodies, often sprinkled with red ochre, symbolizing blood, life, or rebirth. Children were buried with beads. Elders with tools. In one site, a man was buried cradling a dog. They believed something carried on after death. Some may have worshipped nature, the sun, moon, water, trees. Others may have followed ancestor spirits, seeking guidance or protection. Still others might have honored animals as spiritual kin, painting themselves with stripes or horns. And in every community, there were likely rituals. Songs for hunting success. Gestures before crossing a river. Dances during solstice or migration. Paintings to speak with the unseen. There were no temples. No scriptures. But there was meaning, encoded in rhythm, color, fire, and form. Mesolithic spirituality wasn't about gods above, it was about the forces around them. The forest. The animal. The storm. The soul. It was a world of connections, between the living and the dead, the human and the animal, the earth and the sky. And through this spiritual lens, they began to see themselves as part of something greater. The Mesolithic was never meant to last forever. It was a bridge, narrow, uncertain, but transformative, between two worlds, the wild and the cultivated. And by the end of it, humanity was preparing to cross that bridge. Across many regions, we see subtle but undeniable shifts. People weren't just gathering plants, they were managing them. Clearing away competing weeds. Saving seeds. Returning to spots where they had sown them the year before. This was no longer gathering. It was the beginning of farming. In parts of the Fertile Crescent, modern-day Iraq, Syria, and Turkey, humans began cultivating wheat, barley, and lentils. In Southeast Asia, rice appeared. In Africa, sorghum and millet. In Mesoamerica, squash and maize. But it didn't happen overnight. Farming was slow, experimental. It took generations of observation. Of trial and error. Of understanding the seasons and the soil. And just as plants were being shaped, so too were animals. Dogs had already joined the human world. But now came sheep, goats, pigs, gradually tamed, bred, and raised. No longer did humans hunt animals. They took care of them, and in turn, depended on them. This led to bigger changes. People needed fences. Storage. More permanent homes. More cooperation. Farming required planning. It created surplus, and that meant wealth. Not everyone had to hunt. Some could build, trade, lead, teach. Society began to stratify. Roles deepened. Conflict grew. So did innovation. We see pottery appear, first crude, then refined. We see larger buildings. We see wells, granaries, pathways between villages. In some places, even early temples. And perhaps most importantly, we see stories. Carvings, symbols, mythic figures, creatures part man, part beast. Gods of grain. Mothers of harvest. These weren't just dreams. They were the beginning of religion and of history. The Neolithic wasn't just a new tool or a new food, it was a new worldview. It taught humans that they could shape the earth, not just live from it. But it also meant new risks: disease from living close together, dependency on crops, warfare over land. Still, humanity chose this path. And it began in the Mesolithic. From the first shelter to the first seed. From hunter-gatherers to villagers. From survival to civilization. And though the Mesolithic may be forgotten in textbooks, it was here, in the quiet middle, that everything changed.